My mother-in-law stole my credit card and flew her friends to Paris. It's my daughter's money. We'll come back after spending all $35,000, she bragged. I calmly said 2 words. What happened next destroyed her entire world. The notification came through at 2:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, and for exactly 3 seconds I thought it was a mistake. I was sitting at my desk on the 22nd floor of my own building, reviewing a quarterly earnings report that would have made most people in my industry quietly weep with envy when my personal cell buzzed against the polished oak. I had trained myself to ignore most alerts during work hours. This one was flagged high priority by the American Express app, which meant the algorithm had already decided something was wrong before I had. I picked up the phone. Charge approved. $35,000 USD. Merchant. Hôtel de Crillon, Paris, France. Card ending in 4092. The temperature in my office dropped about 15 degrees in the time it took me to read those 4 lines twice. The card ending in 4092 was a secondary platinum line attached to my primary corporate account, a card I kept in the nightstand drawer of the guest bedroom for catastrophic household emergencies. I hadn't touched it in months. I hadn't thought about it since the weekend my mother-in-law, Patricia, had come over to collect my wife's belongings. My wife, or rather as of 3 weeks prior, my ex-wife, Diane. And that's where the story really begins. So let me back up, because none of what I'm about to tell you makes sense without understanding what the last 5 years of my life actually looked like from the inside. I built Vanguard Analytics from a 2-man operation running out of my apartment in Wicker Park into a firm that now occupied 4 floors of a glass tower in downtown Chicago. I was 32. I had been described in 3 separate industry profiles as quietly relentless, which I always took as a compliment dressed as an insult. I dealt in data, risk modeling, and financial forecasting, and I was very good at all 3. Good enough that by the time Diane and I married, my company was generating revenues that most people spend their entire careers chasing. Diane was beautiful, socially magnetic, and absolutely convinced that my success was a natural extension of her orbit rather than the product of a decade of 70-hour weeks. She was not a bad person in the beginning. Or maybe she was, and I was too busy building something to notice. Either way, we spent 5 years in a marriage that looked spectacular from the outside and felt, from the inside, like living in a beautifully maintained house where nobody had turned the heat on in years. Patricia, Diane's mother, a woman whose entire personality consisted of designer labels she couldn't afford, country club gossip she recycled like currency, and a pathological obsession with her brilliant daughter, had decided somewhere around year 2 that I was a useful appliance in Diane's story, rather than a person with my own story. She smiled at me at dinners. She complimented my tie, and she spoke about me, I was told, in the third person at her social functions, as though I were a piece of real estate Diane had cleverly acquired. When I came home early from a New York business trip and found Diane in our bedroom with her 31-year-old personal trainer, a man whose name I had heard approximately 40 times over the previous 8 months, always in the context of, he's just so good at his job, I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I stood in the doorway for exactly 4 seconds, turned around, walked down to the kitchen, poured myself 2 fingers of scotch, and called my attorney, David Mercer, who had been practicing family and corporate law in Chicago for 23 years and had a reputation in the legal community that could charitably be described as surgical. The prenuptial agreement I had insisted on before the wedding had been the one thing Diane's family never forgave me for. Patricia had called it grotesquely unromantic. Diane had signed it anyway because the alternative was no wedding. The agreement contained an infidelity clause with teeth, the kind of language that doesn't just protect assets, but dismantles any retroactive claim to them entirely. By the time the divorce was finalized, Diane had walked away with her personal belongings, her car, which was registered in her name because I'd bought it as a gift, and approximately none of the 8-figure estate she'd spent 5 years telling people she co-owned. Patricia had come to collect Diane's things while I was at the office. I'd allowed it. I had no reason not to. I didn't know she would go through the guest room. I didn't know she'd find the emergency card. I didn't know that a woman who referred to herself as a person of a certain refinement was capable of pocketing a credit card that didn't belong to her and boarding an international flight on someone else's money. But apparently, refinement has a price point, and $35,000 was well above it. I stared at the notification for a long moment. Then I opened my desk drawer and pulled out my personal address book, actual paper, a habit I'd kept from the years before I trusted cloud storage with anything important. I found the number for the Hôtel de Crillon's international concierge line. I dialed. A courteous, accented voice confirmed that a guest named Patricia Harmon was indeed registered in the ambassador suite. I hung up without leaving a message. Then I called Patricia's cell phone directly. It rang 4 times. The connection had that slightly hollow, echoing quality of a transatlantic call, and when she answered, I could hear everything in the background. Champagne flutes, women laughing too loudly, the faint wheeze of accordion music somewhere nearby. She had brought friends. Of course she had. Hello? She answered with the theatrical sigh of someone who had been briefly interrupted from something important. Patricia, I said. My voice was very quiet. Oh, Ryan, she exclaimed. exclaimed, projecting her voice outward toward her friends, making the call into a performance. Don't tell me you're calling to nag me. I am sitting at a cafe near the Champs-Élysées with the girls, and we are having the most spectacular time. You stole my credit card, I said. A charge for $35,000 just cleared at the Crillon. That's grand larceny, Patricia. There was a pause, just a beat, and then she laughed. A loud, braying sound, clearly designed to be overheard by the women at her table. Oh, stop being dramatic, Ryan, she said, waving off the accusation in her voice the way you wave off a persistent waiter. I found that little card in the nightstand when I was collecting Diane's things. Consider it a thank you from the woman who raised the woman who gave you the best years of her life. She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial murmur that still carried. I brought 3 of my closest friends. We are celebrating Diane's freedom. I let her finish. It is not a thank you, I said. It is theft. Oh, please. The sugar dissolved. Underneath it was something older and uglier. My daughter built that company with you. That is her money as much as yours. We are staying in the Ambassador Suite, Ryan, and we will come back to the United States only after spending every last cent on that card. Diane deserves this. And frankly, so do I. I sat very still. Outside my floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago moved in its perpetual, indifferent river of light and traffic. I took a slow breath. Patricia, I said. What? Clipped, arrogant, utterly certain of her position. Diane and I are divorced. A silence fell over the international connection that was so complete, it almost had a physical texture. What? The word came out small. The champagne flute laughter in the background continued, oblivious. The divorce was finalized 3 weeks ago, I said. Diane doesn't have a stake in my company. She never did. That's what the prenuptial agreement she signed was for. The agreement you called grotesquely unromantic. I paused. She walked away with her car and her clothes. That's it. That's a lie, Patricia said, but the booming certainty was gone. Diane would have told me. She didn't tell you, I said, because she's embarrassed. She's currently staying in a furnished studio apartment in Lincoln Park. She's not in a position to loan you money, call off the charge, or do anything else that might help you right now. I heard the quality of the background noise change. The laughing women, oblivious, still at their champagne. Patricia's voice when she spoke again was a register lower, slightly breathless. You're lying to scare me. Patricia, I'm logging into my banking portal right now. A beat. What happens next? I said. You already know. I ended the call before she could respond. Then I dialed the direct Platinum Services line for my American Express corporate account. It connected on the first ring. Good afternoon. This is Julian at Platinum Services. How may I assist you? Julian, I need to report a stolen card and flag fraudulent activity, I said, keeping my voice even and precise. The secondary card ending in 4092 was stolen from my private residence. The pending authorization for $35,000 at the Hôtel de Crillon in Paris was entirely unauthorized. I need that card locked, that charge reversed as fraudulent, and a hard decline placed on any further activity under that card number. Julian's keyboard was clicking before I finished the sentence. I understand, Mr. Vance. I'm locking the card ending in 4092 immediately. The $35,000 charge is being flagged as fraudulent, and the authorization is being reversed to your available credit. No further charges will be authorized under that number. Any attempt to manually force a transaction will trigger an automatic decline and fraud notification to the merchant. Perfect. Thank you, Julian. I hung up. The $35,000 charge disappeared from my digital ledger within 60 seconds. I watched the number vanish from my phone screen with the quiet satisfaction of watching a threat dissolve. I knew exactly what happened next, because I understood how hotels like the Crillon operated. $2,000 a night for the Ambassador Suite. A card on file, now hard declined and flagged for fraud. An outstanding bill already accumulating for the day's champagne, room service, and God knows what spa treatments Patricia and her friends had already run through. The hotel's accounting department would not send a polite email. They would not wait until morning. They would go to that suite directly, professionally, and with the specific energy of an institution that caters to diplomats and does not tolerate financial irregularities. I set my phone face up on the desk and went back to the quarterly report. 12 minutes later, the phone rang. Patricia Sell. I watched it ring to voicemail. 2 minutes after that, it rang again. Diane, ex-wife. She must have already received the panicked international call. I imagined the conversation. Patricia, voice breaking, explaining that the card was declined, that there were hotel managers at the door, that something had gone catastrophically wrong with the plan that was supposed to be untouchable because Diane's money was Diane's money and Ryan would never dare, except Ryan had dared. Ryan had dared the moment a judge signed a divorce decree 3 weeks ago. I watched Diane's name flash twice more, then go to voicemail. Then I blocked both numbers. Not in anger, in the calm, deliberate manner of a man who has already finished grieving and moved on to administration. I was in the middle of drafting a formal police report. I wanted the theft documented with Chicago PD regardless of what happened in Paris, when my desk phone rang at just after 4 p.m. International prefix, +33, France. I picked up. Ryan Vance speaking. Monsieur Vance. The voice was male, authoritative, accented with the specific weight of official official French bureaucracy. This is Inspecteur Rousseau with the Police Nationale in Paris. I am calling from the lobby of the Hôtel de Crillon regarding a serious matter. I straightened in my chair. We have detained an American citizen in the hotel manager's office, the inspector continued. She identifies herself as Patricia Harmon. She attempted to secure an extended stay in a luxury suite, along with substantial food, beverage, and spa charges, utilizing an American Express card registered in your name. The card was declined and flagged for fraud. The outstanding balance for services already rendered is over 5,000 euros. When management requested a secondary form of payment, Madame Harmon was unable to provide one. I heard something in the background, a muffled voice. It sharpened into recognizable sound when the inspector apparently allowed the phone to be angled toward the room. She is claiming, Inspector Rousseau continued, that you are her son-in-law, that you authorized this card as a gift, and that you will verbally confirm these charges immediately. Inspector, I said, Patricia Harmon is my former mother-in-law. My divorce from her daughter was finalized 3 weeks ago. Patricia stole that card from my private residence in Chicago without my knowledge or consent. I did not authorize a single dollar of those charges. I'm currently drafting a formal complaint with Chicago PD for grand larceny. I would encourage you to proceed accordingly on your end. I heard the inspector relay this in rapid French to someone else in the room. Then the sound that came through the phone was something I will remember for the rest of my life. Patricia screaming, not the controlled, theatrical voice she used to perform wealth and authority. This was something unraveled, raw and high-pitched and shaking with a terror that had no room left for performance. Ryan, please don't do this. They have handcuffs. My friends, they left. They just left, Ryan. They packed their bags and walked out. They wouldn't pay. Ryan, I don't have the money. I swear I will pay you back every cent. I will sign anything. Please don't let them take me to a French jail. I listened to the woman who had called me unromantic, who had told her friends at dinner parties that Diane had married beneath her potential, who had laughed from a Parisian cafe and told me she was going to spend every cent because the money belonged to her family. I listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt. When she finally stopped to breathe, I said, "You told me it was your daughter's money, Patricia. So call Diane. Ask her to wire the 5,000 euros. She can't. She doesn't have it. Ryan, please." "Then I think you found the natural conclusion of your trip," I said. "I hope the suite was worth it. I genuinely do." Inspector Rousseau came back on the line, his tone clipped and final. "Your statement is clear, Monsieur Vance. We will proceed with processing Madame Harmon for attempted fraud and theft of services. Thank you for your cooperation." "Good luck, Inspector." I set the receiver back in its cradle. The silence in my office was the cleanest sound I had heard in 5 years. The fallout unfolded over the next 8 weeks with the specific, irreversible energy of a structure that has had its foundation removed. It doesn't collapse all at once. It just becomes, incrementally and then totally, uninhabitable. Patricia's 3 friends, women whose social identities were built entirely on the perception of respectable, consequence-free wealth, had abandoned her in the Crillon lobby the moment the police arrived. Not after a conversation, not after an attempt to help. They had seen the uniforms, calculated their own exposure to an international fraud investigation, and booked last-minute economy seats back to Chicago before Patricia's first phone call to Diane had even connected. They were on a plane while Patricia was still in a manager's office, trying to explain herself to a French police inspector who had no interest in her explanation. They landed at O'Hare and immediately told everyone they knew. The story traveled through their social network with the speed and enthusiasm that gossip always achieves when it involves the public humiliation of someone who had been aggressively performing superiority. By the time Patricia had navigated the French court system and secured her own release, which required Mark to take out a high-interest short-term loan against the equity in her heavily mortgaged home, a home that then became subject to foreclosure proceedings when the loan payments proved unmanageable. The country club community she had spent 20 years curating had already rebuilt its hierarchy without her in it. She came home to Chicago a woman entirely without armor. Diane, meanwhile, attempted the one move she had left. She hired a cheap civil attorney and filed a lawsuit claiming retroactive spousal support on the grounds that she had grown emotionally and financially dependent on our shared lifestyle, and that my decision to divorce her, citing her infidelity, which the prenuptial agreement specifically addressed, constituted a form of financial abuse. I didn't attend the preliminary hearing. My attorney, David Mercer, 23 years in family and corporate law, walked into that courtroom with 3 documents: the original prenuptial agreement, the time-stamped texts and photographs establishing Diane's affair with her personal trainer, and a copy of the active Chicago PD complaint documenting her mother's theft of my credit card. The judge looked at the prenuptial agreement, looked at the evidence of infidelity, looked at the theft complaint, and looked at Diane's attorney with an expression that contained no ambiguity whatsoever. The case was dismissed with prejudice. Diane was ordered to cover my legal fees for wasting the court's time. David called me with the verdict from the courthouse steps. I was in a meeting. I stepped out, listened to him deliver the news in his typically understated way. "It went as expected, Ryan," thanked him, and went back to my meeting. I didn't call anyone to celebrate. I didn't draft a triumphant message. I just let the machinery of consequence consequence, finish its work and went back to building things. 12 months later, I was standing at the head of the boardroom table on the 22nd floor, looking at a $50 million acquisition contract that would make Vanguard the dominant firm in our sector. My senior team was assembled around the long mahogany table. David Mercer was there, smiling in the careful, contained way of a man who rarely smiles publicly. He slid the contract across the table, along with a heavy gold fountain pen. "Everything is in order," he said. "Your signature closes the deal." I picked up the pen. I had heard through the ambient information network of a city where financial circles overlap and news travels sideways that Diane was currently managing social media accounts for a mid-size wellness brand in Wicker Park, that her personal trainer had moved on to another client and another dynamic approximately 4 months after our divorce, that Patricia's house had gone into foreclosure and she was renting a 2-bedroom unit in a suburb she had previously described at a dinner party I attended as where people go when they've given up. They had looked at me, both of them, through 5 years of marriage and its aftermath, and seen a man who could be used, a man whose success was a resource to be accessed and whose boundaries were a performance to be ignored. They had stolen $35,000 from me not out of desperation, but out of absolute bedrock certainty that they were entitled to it. Patricia had laughed on an international phone call from the Champs-Élysées and told me she was going to spend every cent. What she hadn't understood, what neither of them had ever understood, was that you don't steal from someone who builds things for a living without also inheriting their architecture. The trap was not something I designed in the moment. It was the natural structure of a life built on documented evidence, enforceable agreements, and the particular patience of a man who understood that the best response to entitlement is never rage, it's precision. I signed my name on the dotted line, Ryan Vance, founder, CEO. The room applauded in the quiet, measured way of professionals who understand the size of what just happened. I capped the pen and handed the contract back to David and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows at the far end of the room. Below me, Chicago moved in its enormous, indifferent, magnificent river. The lake beyond it was the specific gray-blue of late September, catching the light the way only cold, deep water does. I thought about Patricia in the lobby of the Hôtel de Crillon, her friends already boarding a plane, a French police inspector relaying my words back to her while she stood in an elegant hotel office in a city she had stolen her way into, finally understanding, for the first and last time, that the money she had spent 5 years treating as an inheritance had never belonged to anyone but me. She hadn't bought a luxury vacation. She had bought the precise, efficient instrument of her own complete destruction, and I had paid for the whole thing. I looked out at the city and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. Not triumph, not relief, something quieter and more permanent than either. The specific, uncluttered peace of a man who built everything he has entirely by himself, who almost lost it to people who confused his patience for permission, and who had the documentation to prove the difference. The view from up here, I thought, looking at the lake and the skyline and the whole enormous, indifferent, beautiful machine of the city below, the view from an empire you built alone is something no one can steal from you, not even from Paris.